Welcome to vintagesf. This is Recommendation May, where people recommend books to me. Here in Winnipeg, I volunteer with the Children's Hospital Book Market, and one of my friends there sometimes finds books and asks me if I'm interested in them. So, not so much a recommendation as someone who knows some of my interests. And this is the book that they found for me. Science Fiction Today and Tomorrow, a discursive symposium. And here are all the authors. Ben Bova, Frederick Pohl, George Sobrowski, Frank Herbert, Theodore Sturgeon, Alan E. Norse, Thomas N. Scorsia, Reginald Bretnor, James Gunn, Alexei and Corey Panchin, Paul Anderson, Hal Clement, Anne McCaffrey, Gordon R. Dixon, and Jack Williamson, and it's edited by Reginald Bretnor. This was first published by Harper & Row in 1974 and Penguin Books in 1975. This unique anthology surveys the role of science fiction in the modern world. Extremely diverse as writers and as personalities, the contributors are all prominent in the SF field. The subjects they explore range from the publishing of science fiction to science fiction and the visual media, from science fiction morals and religion to romance and glamour in science fiction, from the creation of imaginary beings to the creation of imaginary worlds. Read together, these essays reflect the inexhaustible richness of science fiction today. As Theodore Sturgeon has written, a more rounded and readable survey of the field would be hard to imagine. Isaac Asimov says, the most interesting volume dealing with science fiction that I have ever read. And it's listed as literary criticism of science fiction. Nonfiction about science fiction is a niche that I love to collect and read. At first, when I started reading this book, I thought, I'll just take a few quotes from each of the essays and let you see what they are about. But I found one essay that I really connected with, and I thought maybe I should just go in depth with that essay. Let me just say that the rest of the essays in the book, there's some ups and downs, some great ones about history of the magazines and how things have changed over time, some reflections from 1974 on the New Wave, which was very current at that point. And so it's like any other collection of essays. But there's one essay, and the essay that I want to focus on is by James Gunn. It's called Science Fiction and the Mainstream. Now, before we get started, I just want to say a couple things about James Gunn. I've read his novel, The Joy Makers, and I'll put a link to the review in the description below this video here. I also have another very interesting book by him called Alternate Worlds, The Illustrated History of Science Fiction by James Gunn. Why this is interesting to me is that James Gunn is a professor of writing. This was, of course, in the 1970s, but of fiction writing and of science fiction in the University of Kansas. So Gunn is a scholar who researches science fiction. And in this book right here, it's illustrated, but there's also 100,000 words about science fiction. Gunn also was the president for a number of years of the Science Fiction Writers of America. So we have a person here with experience with the authors in the field, the publishers, and with the history of science fiction. In fact, he taught it. So let's go back to the essay now. I just want to let you know, at the end of this video, I will have every page of the essay there for 5 seconds. So if you want to pause the video and read the pages, you can. I'll also, in the description below, have a link to a Google Doc of a PDF of this article, this essay. So let's dive into some of the concepts here about science fiction and the mainstream. And even though this was written 52 years ago, I think there's some very salient points here. Let me pull out a few quotes to get started. From page 187, in 1914, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes, when it appeared in book form, still could be reviewed, even by such newspapers as the New York Times. 30 years later, Burroughs' books were excluded from most public libraries, along with those of other famous storytellers of the first 2 decades, Garrett P. Serviss, George Allen England, and A. Merritt. In fact, during the 30s and 40s, virtually no hardcover science fiction was being published, only after the end of World War II, first with the fan presses and then with publishers such as Simon & Schuster, Doubleday, Frederick Fell, Random House, and Pellegrini and Cuday did science fiction return to book form. Even then, it received no critical attention. A bit later, when most science fiction novels appeared as paperback originals, they shared the critical fate of all paperbacks: oblivion. One faculty member told me in 1950, science fiction is at best sub-literary. So here we have the fall of science fiction considered something to be reviewed in the New York Times, to be something that was ghettoized, that was something to be looked down upon. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Well, partially to blame, even though it gave a lot of opportunities for writers, were the magazines. But let's go a little bit further. He says something here about this change of attitude. Continuing at the bottom of the page and going on to page 188. What had happened to the genre since H.G. Wells' novels were welcomed by such literary figures as Henry James, who was filled with wonder and admiration by Wells's early work and spoke of reading The First Men in the Moon, as one sips, I suppose, Old Tokay, and of allowing 12 Stories in a Dream to melt, lollipop-wise, upon my imaginative tongue. And Joseph Conrad, who wrote to Wells how much he liked his work, particularly The Invisible Man. Impressed is the word, O realist of the fantastic, and added, it is masterly, it is ironic, it is very relentless, and it is very true. Both James and Conrad kept after Wells to improve his description, his characterization, his subtlety, but they were not put off by his material. One thing that happened to science fiction was a change in criticism and the appearance of the mainstream as a concept. More important than both, however, was the creation of the science fiction magazine. And this is where I just made my little comment in between these quotes. Now, even at this time, there were novels that were written that weren't even considered science fiction. Science fiction hadn't even been invented as a term until 1926 by Hugo Gernsback of Amazing Stories. He called it scientifiction to start with, and that became science fiction. But let's just call it scientific romances or fantastic literature. It was being published still, and there are some major works in the 1920s and 30s. Think We by Yevgeny Samyatin, or perhaps Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, or some of the works of Olaf Stapledon. So in from the novels of the 1800s and early 1900s, the stories that were published just in the regular magazines, to specific science fiction magazines, and as this one prophet told Gunn, it became a sub-literature. It would take decades, even perhaps a century before it was built up again, built up into literature. Now there's lots of examples of literature within the genre, and as Theodore Sturgeon likes to say, 90% of work is not going to be great work in a genre, but that 10% could reach levels that we would call literature, that we would call mainstream, perhaps. Let's go to another quote here in the essay. At the top of page 196, Nietzsche called man a rope stretched between the animal and the superhuman. Arthur Clarke calls man the organic phase between inorganic. It's hard to see, he has said, how on a lifeless planet an IBM computer could evolve without passing through the organic phase first. The intelligent machine may be man's successor. This quote I just found kind of fascinating, and it's something that plays out in today's literature as well. Science fiction seems to be a literature of ideas, and some of these ideas really connect with all people in a very mainstream way. Right now, there's so much discussion about AI and perhaps the rise of robots within our society. What was once considered part of the sub-literature of science fiction now is really mainstream. Many books are written with these concepts in there that are not considered science fiction. In 1989, science fiction writer Bruce Sterling coined the term slipstream. He defines it as a surreal genre of speculative fiction that blurs the lines between mainstream literary fiction and science fiction. Perhaps you could say science fiction has slipped into the mainstream right under their noses and they haven't even realized it. Let's go now to another quote from this essay by James Gunn. Starting at the top of page 198, one reason for getting into space is to attain this perspective, and one of the values of the space program was the photography of Earth from space and the comments of the astronauts. From this group of extroverted pragmatists came such remarks as Neil Armstrong's, "I remember on the trip home on Apollo 11, it suddenly struck me that that tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put up my thumb and shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out the entire Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very, very small. To Bill Anders, the sight of Earth from space evoked feelings about humanity and human needs that I never had before. Rusty Schweikart said, I completely lost my identity as an American astronaut. I felt a part of everyone and everything sweeping past me below. Or Tom Stafford, you don't look down at the world as an American but as a human being. Michael Collins, I knew I was alone in a way that no earthling had ever been before. Or Ed Mitchell, you develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. Any of those statements could have come from Reverend Macmillan in my 1955 short story, The Cave of Night, in which the first man to venture into space gets stranded there and radios back, up here you wonder why we're so different when the land is the same. You think we're all children of the same mother planet. Who says we're different? I have seen the Earth, as no man has ever seen it, turning below me like a fantastic ball, the seas like blue glass in the sun, or lashed into gray storm peaks, and the land green with life, the cities of the world in the night sparkling, and the people. What the astronauts felt is what science fiction, at its best, can achieve. What other kind of fiction has this capability? This is perspective and insight, a literature like no other that can give us this awe, this wonder, this knowledge of our place in a bigger and bigger setting. I will also say that it can bring a sense of wonder that is difficult to replicate in other literature. I know I was following Artemis 2 as it was going around the moon and looking at the Earth rising behind the moon. Besides those people in that capsule on Artemis 2, you could see every person on Earth in that picture. Science fiction can give you pause, perspective, and insight. One of the interesting points that Gunn brings out in this essay is how previous literature influences what is being written now. So we had some of those giants of the 1800s. We had Mary Shelley, we had Jules Verne, we had H.G. Wells. They were just writing books, literature. But then with the start of the science fiction magazines, we had a whole generation of young people reading stories from these magazines. And the people who were writing these stories were writing for all kinds of genres and were just trying to get as many stories out there as possible to earn a living. So with a generation growing up with the magazines of the 20s and 30s, we get an echo chamber of sorts with the things that we see in the 40s and the 50s. And even into the 1960s, there's almost a double echo chamber from the 20s and 30s and from the 40s and 50s. But what happens then is we also have some people trying to push further. It's sort of like the unrest of the 1960s also came into literature as well, and an unrest in the science fiction literature where they tried to be more experimental potentially. And this sometimes is called the New Wave, at least from the UK and some of the writers here in North America as well. James Gunn is writing just after this period here, and here's what he has to say. This is from the last part of the essay. From page 214. The old science fiction unity, the brotherhood of writers and editors and readers who learned only from each other and built upon each other's concepts, is dwindling as alternate methods of publication, original anthologies, paperbacks, even hardcovers have become more numerous and more important. The ghetto walls are demolished. The us against the rest of the world mentality is fading. The consensus future and the philosophical position on which it was built is beginning to fall apart as science fiction splinters into 100 markets, into 1,000 disparate individual visions. Science fiction will bring nothing to the mainstream if it surrenders to mainstream philosophies and mainstream values. Both science fiction and the mainstream will be stronger if science fiction retains its unique concepts, narrative strengths, idea orientation, detached viewpoints, and commitments that it developed over the long years of isolation. So if you're interested in this essay, you can find it at the end of this video, or if you go into the description below, I have a link to a Google Doc PDF of this article, this essay. I found it a fascinating read. I want to read more James Gunn. I want to definitely get into reading alternate world, some of the essays within here. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about SF and the mainstream. Please comment below. I think it could be an interesting discussion. Until next time, keep reading.